probably...
Are you saying, though, that they're limited by practical concerns or constitutional concerns?
Constitutional concerns, and then practical concerns will come up as well.
Well, let's put aside the practical concerns. I'd like to understand just the answer to Justice Kavanaugh, why tomorrow Congress couldn't transform every cabinet official into a multi-member group. What's the constitutional problem with that, I think, is what my colleague was getting at.
Absolutely. And the constitutional problem, in our view, is that Congress cannot limit the president's authority over officers who are wielding the president's conclusive and preclusive constitutional powers. And that is a line that goes all the way back to Marbury v. Madison. It's a through line through this court's jurisprudence, including Justice Jackson's
The FTC has the authority to enter foreign agreements, right? I mean, how do you decide what's conclusive and...
Did you feel that sharp sting of panic in the air as you watched this exchange? This moment where the carefully constructed architecture of democratic accountability was being dismantled in real time, while we all bore witness to the quiet demolition of congressional power disguised as a discussion of constitutional doctrine? Because what you just experienced was not simply a legal argument about administrative law or an abstract debate over separation of powers theory, but rather the unveiling of a decades-long project to concentrate virtually unlimited authority in the hands of a singular executive who can fire any official for any reason or no reason at all, while systematically stripping away the very structures that Congress established to protect the public from the whims of authoritarian impulse. And you need to understand right now that President Donald Trump fired FTC Commissioner Melissa Slaughter on March 18, 2025, and the unitary executive theory pushed by the Trump administration argues that the president should have complete control over the executive branch, and what we witnessed in those oral arguments was conservative youth Supreme Court justices signaling they will uphold the legality of Donald Trump's firing of a Federal Trade Commission member and give a historic boost to presidential power while also imperiling a 90-year-old legal precedent, and this is happening right now in December 2025, while the stakes could not possibly be higher for everything we claim to value about democratic governance and institutional independence. Let me walk you through exactly what's unfolding, because this is genuinely terrifying in its implications, and the bombshells just keep dropping one after another. Justice Sonia Sotomayor told the government's lawyer, "You're asking us to destroy the structure of government and to take away from Congress its ability to protect its idea that the government is better structured with some agencies that are independent." And she was absolutely correct, because what the Trump administration seeks through Solicitor General D. John Sauer is nothing less than the obliteration of the entire framework of independent agencies that have regulated everything from consumer protection to labor rights to environmental safeguards for the past 90 years, since the New Deal established that Congress could in fact create expert bodies insulated from partisan political pressure. The conservative justices are not even hiding their contempt for this arrangement anymore. Chief Justice Roberts told Slaughter's lawyer that the FTC at the time of that decision was far less powerful than it is today, suggesting that the precedent is a relic of the past, and said Humphrey's executor is just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was, which is an astonishing dismissal of precedent that has structured American governance for nearly a century, and reflects the contempt these justices hold for the very concept of congressional design of government. Now here is where it gets even more chilling, because the exchange you heard in that clip reveals the sweeping theory of presidential power that undergirds this entire demolition project. When the attorney for Commissioner Slaughter tried to draw a line between which officers the president can fire at will and which ones Congress can protect through for-cause removal provisions, he said the constitutional problem is that Congress cannot limit the president's authority over officers who are wielding the president's conclusive and preclusive constitutional powers, and this phrase conclusive and preclusive comes directly from the 2024 immunity decision, in which Roberts included the power to fire among the president's conclusive and preclusive powers that Congress lacks the authority to restrict. So what we are witnessing is the Supreme Court building a doctrine of presidential supremacy, brick by brick, where the president becomes essentially unreviewable and unaccountable in vast swaths of executive authority. The conservative justices pressed Slaughter's attorney relentlessly on hypotheticals about whether Congress could transform cabinet departments into multi-member commissions, and the entire line of questioning was designed to make any congressional limitation on presidential firing power seem absurd and unworkable, when in reality, multi-member commissions with members enjoying some kind of removal protection have been part of American governance since 1790, which means this is not some radical departure from founding principles, but rather the conservatives who are engaged in radical revisionism, The historical dimension of this case matters immensely because conservatives love to invoke originalism when it serves their purposes. Strikingly absent from the oral argument was any interest from the conservative justices in probing what the Constitution's history and original meaning say about independent agencies, and the Constitution was originally ambiguous about the scope of presidential authority to fire federal officers, as extensive scholarship and an abundance of amicus briefs in this case have shown. Yet both the Solicitor General and Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrongly suggested that early precedents barred Congress from limiting the president's firing authority, which is simply not supported by the actual historical record. Scholars who have done painstaking archival research have demonstrated that recent research has undermined historical arguments for a categorical rule that would extend removal at pleasure to all officers or all principal officers, and yet the conservative supermajority is poised to impose exactly such a categorical rule based on their ideologically driven reconstruction of a founding era that never existed in the form they imagine. This is outcome-driven jurisprudence masquerading as constitutional fidelity, and it represents the culmination of a multi-decade project by the Federalist Society and conservative legal movement to reshape American government in ways that would be unrecognizable to the framers they claim to revere. Let us talk about what is really at stake here, beyond the technical legal doctrine, because the case could transform the federal government and effectively end the independence of some 24 bipartisan agencies that Congress had designed to be insulated from political interference and direct White House supervision, and we are talking about agencies that touch virtually every aspect of American life. Congress created the FTC in 1914 as a bipartisan independent agency tasked with protecting the American economy from unfair methods of competition, and by law the 5-member commission can have no more than 3 members of the same political party, and commissioners can only be fired for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. But Trump fired Commissioner Slaughter anyway, telling her simply that her continued service on the FTC is inconsistent with the Trump administration's priorities, which is precisely the kind of naked political purge that Congress sought to prevent when it established independent agencies in the first place. And this is not just about the FTC. Because since January, Trump has also removed Democratic members from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, in what amounts to a systematic effort to politicize and control every lever of regulatory authority in the federal government. Justice Elena Kagan understood exactly what was happening, and she tried to warn her colleagues that the result of what the administration wants is that the president is going to have massive, unchecked, uncontrolled power, not only to do traditional execution, but to make law through legislative and adjudicative frameworks, and what you are left with is a president with control over everything, including over much of the lawmaking that happens in this country. And this is the central issue that should alarm anyone who cares about the separation of powers, because these independent agencies do not merely execute the laws passed by Congress, but they engage in quasi-legislative rulemaking and quasi-judicial adjudication, which means concentrating control over them in the president gives one person authority over functions that the Constitution distributes across 3 separate branches. Justice Neil Gorsuch acknowledged that a lot of legislative power has moved into these agencies, but said that if they're now going to be controlled by the president, it seems to me all the more imperative to do something about it. And he asked the Solicitor General whether the administration might be willing to revive the non-delegation doctrine to limit congressional delegations of authority to agencies, but this reveals the cynical game being played here because Gorsuch knows full well that reviving non-delegation require overturning decades of precedent and would paralyze the modern regulatory state entirely, which is precisely what conservatives want. They are not offering a coherent theory of governance, but rather deploying whatever doctrinal tools are available to dismantle the administrative state piece by piece. The unitary executive theory that animates this entire project has a specific ideological genealogy that we need to understand, because it did not emerge from careful constitutional analysis, but rather from predecessor to the Reagan administration, which was the first presidential administration to cite unitary executive theory, and it then entered public discourse with the George W. Bush administration and found a strong advocate in President Donald Trump, and the theory holds that the president should have complete control over the executive branch, and under this theory the president should be able to fire any member of the executive branch, and laws that restrict his ability to do so violate the constitutional separation of powers between the 3 branches of government. But this is an extremist reading of Article 2 that finds no support in the actual text, which simply vests executive power in the president and requires faithful execution of the laws without saying anything about unlimited removal authority. Indeed, if courts uphold arguments based on the so-called unitary executive theory, it would give Trump and subsequent president unprecedented power to remove and replace any federal employee and impose their will on every decision in every agency, and legal scholars across the political spectrum have warned that Trump's campaign against agency independence is part of his undisguised effort to effectuate a radical dismantling of the checks and balances system without actually amending the Constitution, and it goes hand in hand with his efforts to reshape the civil service, Praetorianize the military, and staff the administration from top to bottom based on personal fealty rather than qualifications and proven character, which is the language of autocracy, not constitutional governance. Let me give you another bombshell that demonstrates just how far this Supreme Court has already traveled down this authoritarian path. Because during a Friday panel discussion hosted by the Federalist Society on Slaughter v. Trump, a law professor said the court's emergency 6-3 stay overturning the lower court's rulings gives a really strong indication that we know how the story ends, and she is absolutely right that the conservative supermajority has already shown its hand. Lower courts found that the district judge deemed Slaughter's termination unlawful and ordered the Trump administration to reinstate her, and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals panel voted 2-1 against the administration, but the Chief Justice John Roberts granted an administrative stay, and the Supreme Court then granted the stay and granted certiorari, which means the conservative justices were so eager to hand Trump this victory that they could not even wait for the normal appeals process to play out. This is outcome-driven jurisprudence in its most naked form, and it represents the prioritization of presidential power over every other constitutional value, including the rule of law itself. The conservative justices tried to downplay the revolutionary nature of what they are doing. Solicitor General Sauer told them the sky will not fall, and the entire government will move toward accountability to the people, which is an Orwellian inversion of reality because concentrating power in the hands of one person who serves for 4 years and can be elected with a minority of the popular vote is the opposite of democratic accountability. Real accountability comes from having expert agencies staffed by career civil servants who apply their professional judgment according to statutory mandates without fear of political retribution, and what Trump and the conservatives seek is to replace that model with a system of personal loyalty where the president would be able to fire all the scientists and the doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replace them with loyalists and people who will simply do whatever the president demands, regardless of the law or the public interest. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson recognized this danger, but the conservative supermajority does not care because their project is not about good governance, but about ideological transformation of the administrative state. Now let me tell you about the truly sinister dimension of this case, which is that it is part of a coordinated assault on democratic institutions that extends far beyond independent agencies, because upon taking office, Trump undertook mass firings of federal employees, inspectors general and members of independent agencies and oversight boards who could attempt to block or constrain his moves, and legal analysts described such firings as setting up Supreme Court cases that could expand his power over independent executive branch agencies that Congress arranged to be insulated from presidential control, which means Trump deliberately provoked these constitutional crises in order to get favorable rulings from the Supreme Court that he and his Federalist Society handlers have packed with ideological conservatives. This is how authoritarianism advances in modern democracies, not through military coups, but through the systematic capture of legal institutions and the gradual concentration of power in the executive, while the judiciary provides constitutional cover for what would have been recognized as tyranny by any previous generation. Project 2025, the right wing's roadmap to an imperial presidency, is anchored in the unitary executive scheme, and this radical governing philosophy, which contravenes the traditional separation of powers, vests presidents with almost complete control over the federal bureaucracy, including congressionally designated independent agencies, and as detailed in Project 2025, Trump would circumvent Congress by taking complete control of all administrative agencies that protect our health, safety, food, water, climate, and labor rights, and this is not speculation, but the openly stated agenda of the conservative movement. The implications for democracy are genuinely terrifying, because once you accept the premise that the president can fire anyone in the executive branch for any reason, you have effectively eliminated any meaningful check on presidential authority over the vast apparatus of the federal government. Justice Elena Kagan noted that it does not seem there is a stopping point, and she added that independent agencies wield significant legislative and judicial powers, authorities generally exercised by Congress and the judiciary, which means concentrating control over them in the president collapses the separation of powers into a unitary executive that exercises legislative, judicial, and executive functions simultaneously. This is precisely the combination of powers that the framers sought to prevent when they divided authority among three separate branches, and yet the conservative supermajority is poised to permit exactly this concentration of power in the name of originalism, which is a cruel historical joke. The conservative justices seemed hesitant to deny presidents the power to fire agency commissioners, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh said once the power is taken away from the president, it's very hard to get it back in the legislative process, which reveals that they understand perfectly well that what they are doing is fundamentally altering the constitutional structure, but they are committed to doing it anyway because their ideological project requires the demolition of the New Deal settlement and the regulatory state it created. Let me give you another absolutely critical point about timing, because the Supreme Court held a crucial hearing Monday on whether presidents have the power to fire heads of independent federal agencies and whether to overturn a 1935 precedent that has bolstered protections from removal for almost a century, and this hearing just happened on December 8, 2025, which means we are living through this constitutional crisis in real time right now, and the court has already shown which way it is leaning because the presidential immunity case came up several times during Monday's hearing, highlighting the court's prioritization of presidential power over other values, and we should expect to see that view reflected in the Slaughter decision, which means the immunity decision from 2024 that granted Trump sweeping protection from criminal prosecution for official acts is now being used as precedent to grant presidents unlimited authority to fire agency officials, which creates a feedback loop of ever-expanding executive power. Each decision by this conservative supermajority makes the next power grab easier to justify, and we are watching the incremental construction of an imperial presidency that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. The Federal Reserve question looms large in this case, because conservatives know they cannot yet sell the American public on the idea that the president should be able to fire Federal Reserve governors at will, given the economic catastrophe that would ensue. So the conservative majority said in other Trump dismissal cases that certain members of the Federal Reserve should be protected from arbitrary dismissals because the central bank is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States, and after being asked by Kavanaugh how overturning Humphreys would affect the Federal Reserve, Sauer said the government agreed with the court's previous holding and was not currently challenging removal protections for Fed officials, but as Justice Kagan pointed out, the government's argument should permit arbitrary Fed dismissals too, and it does not seem there is a stopping point, which means the carve-out for the Fed is purely political and has no principled basis. Once the court establishes that the president can fire FTC commissioners at will, there is no logical reason why the same principle would not apply to Fed governors or any other independent agency. The issue will come into sharper focus at next month's hearing in Cook's case, involving Trump's attempt to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook, and figuring out how to protect the Fed while granting new presidential firing powers over other agencies could loom large in resolving both cases, so the court is trying to thread an impossible needle where it expands presidential power massively while carving out exceptions that have no constitutional justification other than fear of immediate economic collapse. Here is what makes this moment so dangerous and why progressives need to understand the stakes with absolute clarity, because Sauer said the Humphreys executor decision hasn't withstood the test of time and had enabled a headless fourth branch of government, the administrative state that conservatives and business interests have been taking aim at for decades. And this language of the headless fourth branch is straight out of the conservative legal movement's playbook, where they portray expert agencies as unaccountable bureaucrats, when in reality, these agencies are the only entities standing between corporate power and complete regulatory capture. The conservative project is not about democratic accountability, but about eliminating the constraints that protect workers, consumers, and the environment from exploitation, and the Supreme Court's conservative majority has been on a steady march of increasing the power of the presidency starting well before Trump's time in the White House, and under Roberts' leadership, the court has issued a series of decisions dating back to 2010 that have steadily whittled away at laws restricting the president's ability to fire people, and in 2020 Roberts wrote for the court that the president's removal power is the rule, not the exception, which means this is not about Trump personally, but about a systematic ideological transformation of the constitutional order that will outlast any individual president and entrench conservative priorities for generations. The progressive response to this catastrophe has been far too muted and technocratic, when what is required is moral clarity about the authoritarian implications of concentrating this much power in the presidency, because recent rulings indicate that the High Court is leaning toward expanding the type of presidential power that is more emblematic of dictatorship than democracy, and we need to say that plainly without equivocation. Conservative legal theorists formed the unitary executive theory in the 1980s to help President Ronald Reagan roll back liberal policies, and the unitary executive theory promises to radically expand presidential power, and it has been a 4-decade project to reach this moment where a captured Supreme Court is poised to hand down a decision that could fundamentally alter American governance. The fact that 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court as of early 2025 were executive branch lawyers in the Reagan and George W. Bush administrations, whose legal teams focused on ways to expand presidential power, tells you everything you need to know about how this court was constructed and why it is delivering these outcomes. The question of remedy is also crucial, because even if a firing turns out to be illegal, the court wants to decide whether judges have the power to reinstate someone, and Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote earlier this year that fired employees who win in court can likely get back pay, but not reinstatement, which would mean that even when the president acts illegally, there is no effective remedy because the official cannot be returned to their position. This is how you construct a system of presidential impunity, where even when courts find that the law has been violated, there are no meaningful consequences, and the president simply gets to install his preferred loyalist anyway. It is lawlessness dressed up in the language of remedial doctrine, and it represents yet another way that this conservative supermajority is systematically dismantling the rule of law while pretending to uphold constitutional principle. We need to understand that this is not happening in isolation, but is part of a broader pattern where, deploying originalist arguments, the conservative justices on today's Supreme Court have served notice that they are prepared to weaken and restructure contemporary government in order to return us to their vision of our constitutional past. And for these justices, the fact that their originalist interpretations align perfectly with the deregulatory and anti-government program of today's Republican Party is a mere coincidence, and this turning point represents the culmination of the right's decades-long project to dismantle the administrative state, and nothing less than the future of effective governance is at stake. And the dismantling includes attacks on Chevron deference, which was overturned last term, attacks on agency rulemaking authority through the major questions doctrine, attacks on agency adjudication, and now this frontal assault on agency independence through the removal power. Each piece of the administrative state is being systematically torn down, and what will replace it is a system where corporate interests face minimal regulation, where workers have no meaningful protections, where environmental safeguards disappear, and where the president can use the apparatus of government as a personal instrument of political will. So when you watch that clip and you hear the conservative justices pressing about whether Congress could turn the Department of Interior into a multi-member commission, what you are witnessing is not a good faith exploration of constitutional limits, but rather the construction of a constitutional limits, revolution that will reshape American government for generations. And if the Supreme Court invalidates the removal protections for FTC commissioners, such a decision is likely to reach far beyond the commission, and because many statutes restrict a president to removing an official for inefficiency, neglect of duty, and malfeasance in office, the High Court will likely say those words are an unconstitutional restriction on the president, so all the other agencies with those words will be in the same boat, which means this one decision could affect dozens of agencies employing hundreds of thousands of workers who have dedicated their careers to public service based on the understanding that they could carry out their statutory duties without fear of political retaliation. The cruelty is not incidental but essential to the project because the goal is to terrify anyone who might resist presidential directives into submission through the demonstration that loyalty to the president trumps loyalty to law or institutional mission or professional expertise. The ultimate question is whether we still live in a republic with meaningful separation of powers, or whether we are transitioning to a system of plebiscitary authoritarianism, where an elected executive wields essentially unchecked power over the vast administrative apparatus of the state, and the Supreme Court has decided that question in favor of authoritarianism, even if they will not use that word to describe what they are doing. They cloak their revolution in the language of originalism and constitutional fidelity and separation of powers, but what they are constructing is a system that concentrates power rather than dividing it, that privileges presidential will over congressional design, that elevates partisan loyalty over professional expertise, and that systematically eliminates every institutional check that might constrain executive authority. This is not the Constitution framers wrote, and it is not the government that generations of Americans built through democratic struggle, but it is the government that conservative legal elites have engineered through decades of strategic litigation and judicial capture, and now they are on the verge of locking in their vision for generations to come through Supreme Court precedents that will be nearly impossible to overturn. So when Solicitor General Sauer stands before the Supreme Court and argues that Congress cannot limit presidential authority over officers wielding the president's conclusive and preclusive powers, he is not making a narrow technical argument about administrative law, but rather asserting a theory of presidential supremacy that would have horrified the framers who fought a revolution against monarchical power. And when the conservative justices nod along and press the attorney defending congressional prerogatives with hostile hypotheticals, they are not engaged in neutral legal reasoning, but in the active construction of a constitutional order that serves their ideological preferences and the interests of the wealthy and powerful who fund the conservative legal movement. The clip you watched was a glimpse into how democracy dies not with a bang, but through the patient work of judges in robes, systematically dismantling the structures that constrain power, while claiming to honor the Constitution they are destroying. This is the fight of our generation, and we need to treat it as such with the moral urgency and political mobilization that the threat demands, because if we lose this battle over the structure of government, we will spend decades trying to rebuild what is being torn down right now in December 2025, in a Supreme Court that has become the most dangerous branch for anyone who believes in democratic governance and the rule of law.